All right, thanks everybody for joining us today for our webinar on the many uses of your Nature's Notebook data. I am pleased that we have our USA-NPN director, Theresa Crimmins, here today, and she's going to be sharing about all the ways that your data are being used. So I'm going to turn it over to Theresa.
Thanks so much, Erin. I need for you to give me permission to start my video, please. And while you're working on that, I just want to say a huge welcome to everybody that's on here. I'm so excited to have this opportunity to share with you some of the many ways in which the data that you're collecting on plants and animals across the country are being used. Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Erin. Erin, were you going to do a little intro and ask folks about where they're from and stuff?
Yes, we have people that are chatting in right now about where they're from. I'll go through some of those. We have a lot of people that have chatted in. So people from, let's see, the Arnold Arboretum, Pepperwood Preserve, Michigan, people participating in pollen trackers, a couple from Tucson, Wells Reserve, Tennessee, North Carolina. So people from all across the country.
Awesome. That's so great. Welcome. This is so exciting. Well, I want to start out first with just a huge thank you. I want to thank you for your interest in phenology. It's so fun to be among a group of like-minded individuals that get excited about plants and animals and about things like when flowers start opening and leaves start appearing and little eggs start hatching. And my only wish is that we were all in the same room and we could be enthusiastic about this together. I also want to thank you for all of the observations that you've contributed over the years, because I have a feeling that there are a number of people on here who have been really dedicated long-term observers in Nature's Notebook. And I want to thank you for being here today. We haven't done a webinar in a while, and we sort of felt like, why not? This seems like a great time to do it because they're all the rage right now. Everybody seems to be much more comfortable using Zoom these days. And it's cold. It's so cold in most of the country. And it's just fun to be able to have an opportunity to start to think about spring, even if when you look out your window, you're seeing 3 feet of snow, which is what I know a lot of people across the country are seeing right now. But if you aren't yet seeing signs of spring like this, crocus is just starting to peek out of the soil, and pussy willow buds just starting to pop, or little leaves starting to emerge from their leaf buds. Hopefully this will help get you excited about the start of spring. So to kick us off, I'm curious to know how many folks that have joined us, and we have almost 100 folks logged on now. How many of you have contributed to Nature's Notebook in the past or are actively contributing right now? So Erin just launched a poll for us. Excuse me. And the numbers are coming in very quickly. This is awesome. And it's looking pretty heavy toward, yes, we have a lot of Nature's Notebook observers on here. Pretty cleanly falling, around 3/4 of you are Nature's Notebook participants. And almost everybody voted on here. Oh, do I need to? Okay. Super, thank you. Okay, well then that's good. This will be helpful, hopefully helpful information. So to start out, I wanted to just kind of characterize briefly who all are our contributors. And this is a plot that shows how many people have contributed data since Nature's Notebook, whoops, sorry about that, I don't know why that auto-advanced. Since Nature's Notebook launched in 2009. And what you can see is that after 2009, we had really pretty steady growth. And then we kind of topped out around close to 3,500, 4,000 contributors each year in the last several years. But I want to have a huge, I don't know, congratulations and express so much appreciation for the fact that the number of contributors that, representing last year is just about as high as the previous 3 years. And that's a phenomenal achievement, given that last year was the massive challenge that it was in so many ways. And I'm really excited to report that as of this morning, We've had 545 individuals contribute data to Nature's Notebook so far this year, since January 1st. And that's a pretty great achievement too, given that, again, so much of the country is buried under ice and snow, and there's probably not that much to enthusiastically report about. However, I can take this moment to remind you that if you are a Nature's Notebook participant, then you know that how it works is that you're asked to report, do you see things like open flowers, yes or no? And you can always go in and report no, even if you're not seeing anything right now, because those no observations really are very important for us to be able to know, indeed, something was not happening yet. So one thing that we hear pretty frequently among observers is, where do my data go? Do these observations that I actually collect go anywhere? And do they just sit in a database, or does somebody actually look at them? And can you tell me, what happened with those observations that I contributed? And the resounding answer, the answer to whether people use the data that you contribute is a resounding yes. And the data that you've been contributing, that's what I'll be talking about today. And I'm only going to be able to give you a small number of the huge number of examples that we have where these data are being used in scientific discovery and a lot of decision making. And I want to point out too, the number one reason why documenting what you're seeing on plants and animals when you see them is that it's something that can never be repeated. If I go outside right now and I say, yes, I do see flower buds on my grapefruit tree, because I'm fortunate enough to be in Tucson, Arizona, but I don't see open flowers, that's an important thing for me for it's documenting what's happening on that tree right now. And some of those historical records are some of the best information that we have to be able to compare how things are changing. And if I don't go out and document that, I can never go back in time and remember what happened on this day. And so every single report that's being made is a really important documentation of what is happening in time that we can reference going forward. And so we have some really excellent examples of where folks did take the time to document what was happening in their property or on their land in the past. And those records have been hugely valuable for documenting what we're seeing now and how evaluating weather conditions have changed. So one example comes to us from Middleborough, Massachusetts. There was this really fabulous individual named Kathleen who kept track, starting in the 1960s, of what happened on her farm in Massachusetts. And she kept track of all sorts of events, things like when plants were in flower, when butterflies were seen in flight, when amphibian, like frogs and toads were singing, when birds showed up. And those records were used by scientists to document whether things changed. And what she had documented was that in this particular example, they plotted what was the first day each year that Kathleen reported that she saw wood ducks on her pond. And you can see that in the early part of the record, the x-axis is the year. So we're starting at the beginning of the record on the left side and going through to almost to present on the right side of the graph here. And then on the y-axis, this is the day of year. And Julian date or day of year is something that people in the field of phenology use a lot as a way to document when something happened. Basically, what that means is that January 1st is day 1, January 2nd is day 2, January 31st is day 31, February 1st is day 32. And so you just have a sequential number representing the day that something happened. And so what we can see from this graph is that Kathleen saw wood ducks first arriving on her pond around day 115, which would be like April, beginning of April, back in the 1960s and early 1970s. And then by the end of the time when she was documenting these things really closely, it had advanced all the way up to like the late 50s, which would be end of February, actually. That's a pretty significant shift in just a couple of decades. And what the authors were able to see also, oops, sorry, that's a little hard to see, is that over that same period of time, average annual temperature had increased pretty dramatically too, by a couple of degrees over that same period. And this relationship between increasing temperature and advancing spring phenology, or the timing of when stuff is happening, is getting to be a pretty common story that we are seeing being documented in a lot of species and in a lot of locations. But what's really cool about this is that it was Kathleen's records, and this is a picture of her. And she never really intended necessarily that her records were going to reveal a pattern like this. She just kept track of this stuff because she truly loved plants and animals and her property, and thought it was cool to keep track of this kind of thing. And now those journals have turned into a really excellent and invaluable record that we can use to be able to document how things have changed. And I apologize, these are the same graphs I just showed you. Another example, and there are quite a few, I wish I could talk about all of them, that this is another relatively recent example that has emerged, which was a hunting guide in Maine also kept track of when things happened in northern Maine, where he lived and worked. And he basically lived and worked outdoors more or less, and was very close to the land and kept close track of what he saw up there in northern Maine. And back in the 1940s and 50s, again, carefully tracked when things like flowers bloomed and trees leafed out, and when migratory birds arrived. And these journals were recently discovered, boxed up in an attic, and some researchers recognized the value of them. And that's them in this photo here. The researchers that analyzed the data are here in front of his barn, actually. And they took the time to go through his handwritten journal records and get it all into a spreadsheet, and then take similar measurements of the same species in current years to then be able to identify, have things changed? And that's what we're seeing on the plot on the right. What we're looking at here is when stuff happened on the y-axis related to how warm April was. And what we see is pretty clear lines here for the flower. I love this. The authors put little tulips to represent flowering and little shrubs to represent leaf out. What this is showing is that the warmer the April temperatures were, the earlier those two things happened. And again, that's not super surprising. That's consistent with what we saw in the previous slide and what we see with a lot of other data too. What's interesting though is that the line for the bird arrivals, the migratory bird arrivals, is not showing that same relationship. And generally, that is because migratory birds, and especially if they are long distance migratory birds, are cued by the conditions from which they are migrating. That's what triggers them to migrate. And often it's things like sun angle. So when the days are getting longer, then the birds say, okay, now it's time for me to go north to my breeding ground. And sun angle and day length actually isn't changing from year to year. And so we tend to not see a strong signal or a relationship with something like spring temperatures and bird arrivals. But those are two excellent examples of how observations or records that were being collected by individuals simply because they loved their environment and they liked keeping track of this kind of thing have become really, really important pieces of information for us to now understand whether things are changing, whether plants and animals are responding to changing conditions, and if so, how. And so the data that you contribute and every single record that you contribute is valued in that same way. So I wanted to just kind of run through quickly. You're in great company here. Who contributes phenology to Nature's Notebook? And I want to just give a shout out to Nature's Notebook too. And again, congratulate you all for contributing to this program, because it's not easy. We know that we ask for a lot. The protocols are challenging. Getting set up is not simple. Making regular observations over the course of the growing season and ideally from year to year is a huge commitment. But the reason why it is that way, we haven't backed down and made things easier, because what you're doing is generating data that are of sufficient rigor and quality that can be used in scientific study and analyses and in decision making. And so we thank you again, and we want to give you a round of applause and appreciate and acknowledge how much effort is going in here. One of the big things that we do, you probably know, again, because many of you are Nature's Notebook participants, you can participate as an individual on your property or at a facility close by your house. That's something that's convenient. And you can participate as part of a group. And we refer to those groups as local phenology programs. And frequently, phenology programs are set up either at schools or arboreta or fish and wildlife reserves or national parks. We have hundreds of these organizations now. And what this bar graph is showing is how many different local phenology programs were contributing observations in the different years. And again, this is huge. This is something that really we value because, in particular, what we've documented is that when individuals participate as part of a group like an active phenology program, the plants and animals tend to be observed for a longer period of time and more frequently over the growing season, which makes sense because you're sharing that responsibility among more individuals. And at the end of the day, why that matters is that results in data that are more robust for analysis and for documenting change. And so here's just a quick breakdown of those different local phenology programs because we thought it was really fascinating to learn. These are folks that responded to our local phenology survey in this past year. We had we had folks representing 81 different local phenology programs respond to that survey. And we have a lot of botanical garden and arboreta contributing, as well as a lot of college and university campuses, and then a whole bunch of other kinds of organizations as well. And I really wish that I could appreciate and shout out to everybody because there are so many. There's hundreds of organizations and thousands of individuals. And this is just a tiny sampling of those different organizations. And I hope that I have represented some of you that are on the call on here. If not, let's follow up so we can get more logos on this slide because there are so many. And so if you're not familiar with who the USA National Phenology Network is, the organization that runs Nature's Notebook, we are an organization that was established in 2007 to collect, store, and share information about when stuff happens in plants and animals. And we do this for the reasons of advancing our scientific understanding of what is phenology, how might it be changing, and what are the consequences of those changes, to support decision-making, and to communicate and connect with individuals of all backgrounds and in all sectors of society across our country and of all ages. And then finally, to create and grow an equitable and inclusive network. Okay, let's the uses. Who the heck uses all these data that we are talking about and how are they being used? This is the fun part. One of the reasons why the National Phenology Network was originally established was because back in the mid-2000s, scientists started to recognize, you know what, phenology is changing. We are seeing stuff happening earlier in the spring. We're seeing mismatches starting to emerge where certain flowers are open and their pollinators are not present, and that didn't used to happen. And we recognize that in other countries, there have been long-term and rigorous programs intended to track and document the phenology, things like leaf out and emergence and that sort of thing, in many decades that have resulted in really rigorous data sets. And we didn't have that here in this country. One of the really big motivating factors was that in 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recognized that, hey, phenology, you know, it's one of the best ways that we can track how plants and animals and ecosystems are responding to rapidly changing climate conditions. It's something that, you know, just about everybody can observe and understand. And it's one of those leading indicators. It's really one of the first ways that we see plant and animal response to changing climate conditions. And so when we launched Nature's Notebook in 2009, this was one of the motivations. We wanted to be able to generate data that would be able to show how things are changing. We are now in our 13th year of data collection, and we now are starting to have enough data that you can begin to see trends. It takes a while before you can really draw a trend line through something, but we have a couple of really strong examples of where Nature's Notebook data are being used to document how things are changing. And this is one study that was published in 2018, where the researcher wanted to look to see how the timing of flowering in common milkweed might be changing. And so the map here that's being shown is all of the locations for where observers in Nature's Notebook had contributed observations on flowering of common milkweed in, let's see, the years were, I think it was 2011 through 2016. So if you happen to be tracking common milkweed in any of those years, 2011 through 2016, you should see your location on the map here, because this researcher pulled all those data. And what he did was basically try to determine whether things had changed. And this is kind of a messy graph, but what this is showing is that temperature is on the x-axis again, similar to one of the previous graphs we saw, and that mean day or average day that the milkweed was documented in flowering was on the y-axis. He didn't fit a line on the graph, but he did fit a line in the paper. And what he showed was indeed there is a trend of advancing flowering for these plants. And that matters because, as you're probably aware, they're a really important food source for monarchs. And though this guy isn't a monarch, this little larva is. And those insects may indeed be impacted by changes in flowering time for their host plants, especially if it keeps advancing. Here's another example, and I can just smell the flowers. I used to live in Michigan, and so I'm very familiar with black cherries and what this smells like. And what these researchers did was, again, take all the observations that individuals all across the country had contributed for flowering in black cherry, and then matched them up with observations that had been contributed through herbariums. And I apologize, I know that the herbarium record I'm showing here is not black cherry, but I couldn't find one. But what an herbarium record is where folks take a sample of a plant out in the field and then press it for safekeeping and for revisiting in the future. And what's really cool about these records is that it's hard to read here, but there's some key bits of information that are included when an herbarium sample is collected. And that includes the location and the date. And then, if you are so inclined, you can go back and look at those individual samples. And so you know that this particular plant was sampled on this date at this time. And oh my goodness, we can also tell it had open flowers. And so what these researchers did was painstakingly look at thousands and thousands of herbarium records for black cherry, and then compare the time of flowering that was seen all the way back from starting in 1875 through present, and then throw the Nature's Notebook records on top, which is part of the reason why you have such a dense clump of points here late in the record, and use those combined data sets, which enables you to have a much longer record over which you're looking, and determine whether the timing of flowering has changed in black cherry. And indeed, they also documented that flowering time has advanced in black cherry. We've had over 95 papers now, scientific studies such as those two, that have used the data in one way or another. And this shows the distribution of when those papers have been published. We've even gotten one in what year are we in? 2021 so far this year. And we're always keeping our eyes out for more, because we know there are many that are in the process of getting analyzed and reviewed and written up. So there's a lot of different ways in which these data are being used. One of the common ways that, there we go. One of the common ways that the data are used is in trying to figure out what is it that causes phenological events to occur. So in the previous examples, I showed, for the most part, flowering. And for the most part, it seemed like the reason, or the conditions that triggered flowering, was springtime warmth. And generally that is a common a common phenomenon that we see. But once we start looking at other phenophases, events that are occurring later in the season, like fruiting or leaf color change, there's not as much known about what drives those things. Similarly, once we get out of temperate systems and into water limited systems like the desert where I live right now, it's more complicated. Often it's a combination of temperature and moisture availability and maybe even sun angle. And so that's some of the fundamental research that folks are doing using Nature's Notebook data, is just trying to figure out what is it that seems to drive leaf out and flowering and leaf color change and migration in these different species, because we don't really know in a lot of cases. So this is one paper that I was a part of a few years ago, where we basically approached the question. We basically said, we know we have a lot of data in Nature's Notebook. Can we actually identify any relationships with drivers yet? And we took a very simplistic approach. We basically said, if we look at just accumulated warmth in the springtime, because we know that that is a common driver, can we see a relationship between different events, basically leaf out or flowering in different species that we have enough data for in the database, and do we see a relationship with temperature? So we basically pulled all the data that we could, and the points that are shown there are the data that we ended up using. And we looked at and were able to establish relationships with accumulated temperature for things like leaf out in forsythia, flowering in Canadian serviceberry, flowering in high bush blueberry. And how we did this was basically look at how much warmth, or basically how warm it had been in the preceding months, and that was generally winter and spring, before the plant did its thing. And in this case, we mean broke leaf bud or opened flowers. And we were able to establish in a number of cases, a couple of dozen species, we were able to establish exactly how much warmth needs to be achieved, or how much a plant needs to be exposed to in order for it to actually undergo that transition. And why that's valuable is that accumulated warmth is typically calculated and accumulated in something called growing degree days. And the National Phenology Network makes maps of how much warmth is accumulated in the form of accumulated growing degree days. This is showing, for example, our growing degree day map for as of yesterday. And if we know exactly how much warmth needs to occur for leaf out or flowering in a particular species to occur, then we can use this information to help anticipate that. Another common way that phenology observations are used is in comparing what's being seen on the ground to what's being seen from sensors that are mounted on satellites and airplanes and drones. Why that matters is that, especially in the case of satellites, images are taken regularly and have been collected over a long period of time. There are satellites that are collecting observations of our Earth, the Earth Observation System satellites that NASA and USGS maintain, that have been in orbit, or are part of a generation of satellites that have been in orbit, in some cases since as early as the 1970s. And so that's a really strong record of information to be able to tap into and, again, understand how things have changed. One of the big drawbacks, though, is that, especially for some of these older sensors, the spatial resolution of the information that's being collected by the satellites is pretty coarse. And so this is not a perfect depiction of this, but basically, a satellite doesn't necessarily see individual trees. It sees all the stuff that falls within a particular block of the Earth's surface, or a pixel, and then kind of muddles it together. And so an analyst using these data won't necessarily know what were the plants that fell within that particular pixel that are resulting in a certain signal. And so having observations that have been collected on the ground that indicate not only the species that are observed, but whether they had leaves on or not, or whether the canopy was full or not, is hugely valuable. And honestly, there are more papers than anything else that have used our data in this way, in comparing to imagery that's been collected by sensors mounted on airborne aircraft or satellites, but I can't even tell them all to you because some of them are extremely technical and I don't really know exactly what they did. But I have a couple of examples just to kind of give you a sense of the kinds of ways that that information is used. And I liked this one because the map on the left shows, again, very clearly whose data got used in this analysis. And what they did was pull all of the records in Nature's Notebook for which there were reports of leaf out and leaf canopy coverage over, oh gosh, I think it was up through, I don't have the time frame on this, probably through 2019 since it was published in 2020, and use that to compare to imagery of deciduous forests that was collected from the satellites. And then I'm not going to do this justice at all, but basically what they did was come up with an algorithm that enabled them to predict how much green up had occurred and when green up was occurring across different forest canopies in the region shown on the right. In a kind of similar example, this is a different paper that similarly used, again, all the observations that could be pulled from Nature's Notebook on springtime leaf out and green up to be able to better understand and establish the relationship with green up and to figure out whether things have changed. And so what's great is that we've had, again, satellites up in orbit long enough now. In some cases, it's going on, a couple of decades or more, that we can actually use that to document clear change. And it not only changed spatially, where forests have contracted or expanded in their distribution, but also to look at whether the green up is occurring earlier or later in the year than it did, say, in the 80s or 90s or early 2000s. And so that's what this study did. And I apologize because this is the best I could do, but this is a really icky, not easy to read image. But what they are showing is the color, the tone of the color indicates whether, over the period that they analyzed, whether spring is advancing, which would be the green and orange tones, or is being delayed, which is the kind of these more blue tones. And so what you're able to see is that there's an interesting spatial pattern here, where in certain patches, like the southeast, the leaf out is occurring earlier, and much earlier in, say, South Chicago and Northern Indiana and those regions, and even up into Minnesota. And then in other parts of the country, it's actually delayed by quite a bit, say the Northern Great Plains state, or sorry, Great Lakes states. I believe this particular study was relatively recent in time, and that can result in different kinds of trends than what you see when you look over a longer period of time. So that's another way that analysts and scientists try to make sense of how things are changing, is to look at changes over a short period of time or a longer period of time, and then across locations as well. We could talk for hours about that, but I won't. Another cool way in which your observations are being used is just simply in basic scientific discovery, just figuring things out that we didn't know before. And there are some fun examples of this. A recent study here looked at whether the urban heat island effect has an impact on phenology. And again, the map on the left shows all of the different data points that were used from Nature's Notebook. This was for leaf out and flowering. And they looked at, let's see, for all the data through 2017. And what's cool is that they looked at over, it was 500,000 records that they pulled and put together here. So it was probably one of those studies that have used more data than others. Well, basically what they were looking to see was, as you're probably aware, especially if you live in an urban environment, and that's what the map on the right here is showing, is that the denser the area in terms of construction and impervious surfaces like roads, then that location tends to accumulate and hold on to temperature more, and nighttime temperatures are much higher in urban areas than in surrounding rural areas. And so do we see a phenological response as a consequence of that? And indeed we do, actually. But what these researchers identified was not only does the extra warmth that plants are exposed to in urban environments lead to earlier leaf out or flowering than in nearby, less developed areas, that relationship is much stronger at higher latitudes. So when you're up in the, say, Michigan and Northeast and Northern Great Lakes states, it can be many days earlier that things happen in urban areas compared to the more rural areas. But once you get down to Florida, actually the relationship falls apart. And if anything, the extra heat that is conferred by the urban environments causes a delay, a bit of a delay in leaf out and flowering. So that was cool because that's something that nobody knew prior to this. Another really neat example, and some of you might recognize this, I don't know if my picture is covering up the logo here, but we worked closely with a student out of Penn State, and her name was Erin Maynard Bean, for several years, and ran a campaign called Shady Invaders, where she basically was interested in knowing how much of an impact, how different was the phenology in invasive shrubs versus native shrubs. And specifically, she looked at, I think it was 6 species of native shrubs and 4 species of invasive shrubs. And it was things like Japanese barberry and a couple of honeysuckles and privet and burning bush. And the reason there is that when you have invasive shrubs in a understory canopy, they do tend to leaf out earlier than the natives. And that can be a problem for the native species because they can outcompete those plants for the nutrients that are available in the soil. They can shade out the natives, further outcompeting them, and leading to this kind of positive feedback where the invasive shrubs do well because they have this advantage, and then they keep doing better. And unfortunately, the natives, if they're not competing as well, can be diminished in their abundance as a part of that community. And so she wanted to document by how much invasive shrubs actually had that competitive advantage over natives. And so by how much were their phenology advanced? And she said, being in Pennsylvania, she knew that she could collect data at perhaps a few locations there in and around State College, but she thought that the study might be a lot richer if we could get data from more locations. And so that's where we called on you. And Erin ran this fabulous campaign with Erin Postumus, who's on the call, and encouraged folks to track the phenology of these different species. And we had, these are good statistics, I want to find them. They ended up getting over 8,000 observations of leaf phenology from almost 800 people at almost 400 sites through 2015 through 2018. And because of that incredible richness of data that you all contributed, she was able to document some really cool findings. And one in particular that really stands out is, indeed, invasive shrubs do tend to leaf out quite a bit earlier than native shrubs. On the y-axis, we have the calendar date here, or that day of year when those things are occurring. However, what we have on the x-axis here is latitude. And so what you'll see is that the higher in latitude you go, the closer in time the leaf out in those two groups of plants occurs, to where once you're at the highest latitudes, they're actually pretty much on top of each other. And so that's a pretty neat finding, that invasive shrubs really have that strongest competitive advantage at lower latitudes. And she would never have been able to pull this off had you not all been dedicated observers contributing those observations of leaf phenology across all of those locations. And hopefully some of you can actually identify your sites showing up on that map. One more kind of neat study of how researchers have undertaken research to understand just kind of basic science is a local example here in Arizona, where researchers looked at the phenology of mistletoe, which I think, and before I moved out here, I only knew it as that plant that we got at the store and hung on the ceiling at Christmas time to try and get someone to kiss you. But it's everywhere here. It's everywhere. And the birds eat the berries and then they drop the berries in their droppings, and those plants, they invade all sorts of different host trees, including palo verdes and acacias and mesquites. And these researchers were curious to know whether the invasion by the mistletoe, the parasite, impacted the phenology of the plants or vice versa, whether the flowering, fruiting phenology of the parasite might be a function of its host plant. So that was kind of just a neat basic research question. And basically what they found was there was not a lot of clear patterns. However, the peak timing of flowering for mistletoe plants found specifically on mesquites did occur weeks later than the flowering in mistletoe for other plants. And so it's just kind of basic natural history documentation of information that we didn't have before. And these researchers used Nature's Notebook to document that, and they used observations contributed by Nature's Notebook observers in the region that were also looking at the same species. In addition to all these different scientific applications, there's quite a few examples of where the phenology data contributed to Nature's Notebook is also being used to support management decisions. And there are quite a few that have been documented, and there's quite a few more that are actively under development right now. But this includes anything from natural resource management to human health, things like pollen and the spread of disease, especially those carried by insects, all the way to just better understanding when phenological events like peak flowering or leaf color change might occur. And that's actually, in some cases, an important natural resource decision, because park managers have to be able to anticipate huge spikes in visitation when something like that happens. So an example here locally from Arizona again, and a very important one really, is this fundamental question of when to most effectively treat invasive buffalo grass. Buffalo grass is a grass that invades our local Sonoran Desert ecosystem. The picture on the left here is a patch of Sonoran Desert that has not been invaded yet by buffalo grass. The picture here progressing to the right is one that has been invaded. And what you can see is that there's a very dense mat of material on the ground that didn't used to be there that can carry a fire. And these fires burn hot, and they burn much, much larger than fires ever did in the Sonoran Desert. And you can see that species like our iconic saguaro, which are not fire adapted, can suffer really serious consequences. So one of the best way that's been identified to control this plant is using herbicide, just broad spectrum herbicide. And it requires that the plant be at least 50% green in order to be most effective. And managers, in many cases, manage a number of different properties where buffalo grass is invaded. And in a lot of cases, they're difficult to get to. The terrain is rugged, maybe off-road, or may just be many miles apart. And so the managers said, it would be so helpful if we could have some kind of idea of when buffalo grass would be green at these different lands, these different areas that we manage, so that we could be more effective with getting out there at the right time when the plant is green, and prioritize which places we check first. And researchers, we had a number of people that were tracking buffalo grass green up through Nature's Notebook here. And researchers were able to establish a relationship between how much rainfall had to fall, and it's at least an inch, but even more likely to be green if you get over 1.5 inches of rain, that will trigger green up. And so now the Phenology Network actually is making forecast maps that managers are using to prioritize where they go out to treat for this grass. Another fire-related example comes from California. I'm sure everybody on the call remembers the devastating fires that occurred last year in California. And a lot of what was burning were these very burnable, very flammable shrubs that occur in the chaparral. Manzanita and this plant chemise are very common and tend to hold a lot of oil in their bark and can burn very quickly. One of the important things for managers to be aware of is when a plant is most likely to be flammable. If a lightning strike or another source of ignition is likely to occur. One of the best ways that they can evaluate live fuel moisture is either by clipping samples of the plants and then sending them to a lab to dry, and that gives you an idea of how much water weight was in the plant, and so therefore how moist the plant was, or to collect that information again from satellites and try to interpret it that way. As you might imagine, in both ways of collecting information, they're pretty time intensive, labor intensive, and you don't get immediate results. It takes a while to collect all those samples and dry them. And in the meantime, the conditions are changing. What managers could really benefit from is something that can immediately indicate the live fuel moisture of the plants, therefore their flammability, the risk of flammability. And I just love this study so much. Researchers took observations that were collected on plants across these fire-adapted landscapes and looked at the relationships between live fuel moisture and phenology. And lo and behold, they found this amazing indicator that when chamise is in flower, it has crossed the threshold from where it had enough moisture that it wasn't very flammable to, nope, now it's time to be concerned. And so now managers simply just need to look at chamise, which again is a very common plant in these landscapes, to understand whether fire risk is a big deal or not. And then finally, this is the paper that just came out this year, early in 2021. In the past, in the Southeast, dogwoods have been a good indicator of when southern pine beetles are going to be out and about. And managers need to know when to go out and put their traps out to try and collect them and keep them from spreading and really doing a lot of damage, because these insects actually have done a lot of damage in southeastern pine forests. And so these researchers recognized that that kind of adage had been established, who knows when. It's just been around for a long time. It was just this adage of, oh, when the dogwoods, when the flowering dogwoods are in flower, that's when we go put out our traps. And so these researchers endeavored to determine whether that's still a good indicator. And they went and got observations of flowering dogwood from Nature's Notebook to try to establish whether that is still a good indicator. And unfortunately, it's not. Their take-home message was that's not the best way to be timing and determining when to go out and put traps anymore. And they didn't have concrete reasons as to why the relationship had changed, but it was suggested that it had something to do with the fact that we're experiencing warmer temperatures now, especially in the winter and the spring, and that's probably causing, well, species are responding differentially to those changing temperature conditions, and so now this relationship no longer holds. And just for fun, I have just a couple of other interesting examples of ways that the phenology data that you contribute are used. We are contacted by the news pretty frequently for reports on what's happening on the ground. And so, especially in years where it's an early spring, we tend to quickly dive into the database and see who has reported what, so that we can, and we have confidence that what's been reported is likely to be accurate. And so we'll tell the reporters what we have been told through Nature's Notebook. Another fun example is, you might recognize, this is Mindy Kaling, and she is producing a show right now that's due out in HBO Max. I think it's next year, I'm not sure. But they reached out to us, the producers for the show reached out to us because they wanted to film on a college campus, and they needed the canopy to be sufficient that they could color it in post-production to look like fall. So they said, we don't care whether it's spring or summer or fall. We just want to know, when are there going to be sufficient somethings, leaves or flowers, in the canopy such that we could color it in post-production to look like fall. And so we worked closely with them to get the appropriate information to guide their filming. We had another recent request that Erin handled, that the actress Kaya Hamilton reached out with a similar request of, what will be in flower in Charlotte, North Carolina in April, so that we can guide our filming. Educators and teachers actually use the data quite a bit. And we know this simply because sometimes they ask us questions, or we can see the download statistics of where things are going. And then writers. We've also been contacted by novelists who needed to kind of fact check, you know, if they're writing a certain scene in a certain location, they want to make sure that when they talk about the magnolias in flower, that they're not wrong. So that's been fun. And then this is a recent example. Some of you might recognize this plot on the left if you receive our newsletters. And if you don't, I strongly encourage you to sign up for them. But there were a number of reports, kind of anecdotally circling on social media and in the news, that there were a lot of things in flower last fall, last October or November or December even, that weren't normal. You know, things like cherries in flower in Massachusetts, and a bunch of other oddball things. And so we had been contacted by Yale Climate Connections and then subsequently NPR to try to verify whether that was indeed the case. And I didn't really know until we went again to the database and looked and saw what species maybe had people reported flowering on in those months last year in 2020 and never reported on in flower in those months in previous years. And we were really surprised to see it was quite a bit of different species. And so that's what that little plot was showing. Okay, so just really quickly, I want to just talk about perseverance here, because all of the things, the many examples that we just went through so quickly could only happen because of you all. And we are so grateful to have now topped 20,000 individuals that have contributed data from all of these locations on this map at 15,000 different locations. And we now have over 24 million records of phenology in our database, enabling the kinds of science and decision-making examples that we just talked about. And it's no small feat either to recognize that this happened even through last year when schools canceled, parks canceled, you know, access to so many of the excuse me, observation sites were prevented. And we saw a clear dip in, excuse me, just need to get some water real quick. We saw a pretty clear response because of the cancellation and the closures that occurred. What this graph is showing is the number of participants contributing data to Nature's Notebook in April of every year. And you see a very clear increase that we had more and more and more people contributing data in every year. And then this pretty significant drop in 2020. And we knew that it was because so many of you could not get to the places where you had been observing, but you persevered and folks hung in there. And this is the same graph for the month of October. And this was so encouraging that folks, you didn't give up. You know, we saw a huge spike in new sites being registered, and things pretty much recovered. And what this plot shows, this is a plot that I like to look at a lot. This is the cumulative number of records coming into Nature's Notebook in every year since we launched the program. And so it hopefully you can see it. I didn't think about this being colorblind friendly, but basically you see 2009 as the red line on the bottom, going up through 2015 as this light blue. And so clearly in every year we got more records in every month. And then things kind of, 2016 is this lighter blue line here. And then 17, 18, and 19 were clumped. We basically leveled off. We had really consistent participation in those 3 years. And then the black line is 2020. And what you can see is that we were ahead of schedule. We were knocking out of the park in 2020, basically until COVID led to all these closures. And then it drifted. The line kind of drifted behind, but it never dropped. It never flattened. Records kept coming in, and it basically at similar to the same rate as in previous years. And last year we ended up with the almost exactly the same number of records as we had achieved in 2016, which in my opinion is a really good achievement given, again, how hard of a year it was last year. And then just for fun, this gray line that's kind of piled on top of everyone else is this year, 2021. And I'm not concerned that it's not on top, and I'm not surprised. Basically, in years that we have early spring, we get more records early. And this year is not that exciting from a phenological perspective in much of the country yet, but I know it's going to pop once things start going. As you probably know, we have a lot of campaigns that we're running to try to generate data and bring in data from a number of different sources. And I think we're going to have to save talking about those for another webinar. But if you aren't familiar with these, come check out the Nature's Notebook website, because these are cool projects that are we're specifically trying to generate data for particular questions and applications. And I just want to finish with a little ray of hope. Spring is on the way. This is our map showing how early or late the start of spring is. And unfortunately, the legend's a little cut off here. The red tones are where leaf out in the earliest species in the spring was early. And so we had some locations where leaf out was actually early, the start of leaf out, the very start of spring. We are now drifting into white and blue tones, which is meaning that that start of spring is actually occurring later than average. And it's probably still going to be blue and white through here a lot, because it's just taking a while for plants to get that warmth that they need to get going. But it is coming. It's almost March now. It's almost calendar spring, so that's something. And finally, I just want to end again with the expression of gratitude that your data and your efforts are truly valued and appreciated and are used. And so we have one more poll question where I'd really love to hear whether going through these examples helped you to see an example of where your data might be used. Hopefully you were able to identify some study where you saw records that you have contributed were being used. Well, that's good. A lot of you are saying yes. Wow, that's exciting. And not sure. Yeah, I know. Not sure is a common answer for me too. It's really quite challenging to know for positive, because we make the data freely available and anybody can download them and do what they will with them. And so it's hard to know. Okay, so where we topped out here was 69% said yes, 13% said no, and 18% said not sure. Thank you, Erin. Okay, with that, we stop. I didn't leave a lot of time for questions within the hour, but I'm happy to stay on as long as any of you want to stay on and talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Theresa. That was such an awesome summary. There's so many amazing publications that have come out and other uses, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more this year. So if there's interest, we could definitely do another one of these kind of webinars in the future. We will have a survey for you when you close out of the webinar, and it'll also be in the follow-up email. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will also be linked in the follow-up email as well, in case you want to refer back to it or send it on to someone else who might want to watch it. So we do have a number of questions. I've tried to answer some of them on the chat and in the Q&A. But there are a couple that maybe we can go over here. We had a couple questions from people that haven't started yet with Nature's Notebook that are looking for just kind of an overview of what it's like to observe, how often should they observe, can they do birds and plants, just basic questions like that. We have a ton of resources on the website, so definitely I put some links as an answer to one of the questions, but just go to Nature's Notebook and we have a lot of information there. But I don't know if you want to say anything, Theresa, about that, just generally how to observe.
Just about how to get going, you mean?
Yeah, I think just a basic of what it's like, what the frequency is that we're asking for. And another question that was kind of similar was, there's nothing happening right now, but can I start in the spring?
Yes. Yes. So again, if you aren't familiar with how it works, you set up a profile, which means an account for yourself, and then you establish a site. And generally, we recommend that be something that's really convenient for you, like your yard. And then if you're going to do plants, you'll need making observations on the same individual plants repeatedly, And if it's for animals, you'll just be reporting on the animals that you see, that you encounter at your site. And you are invited to make periodic observations again on those same individual plants or animals at the site. And each time you're making an observation, it's a series of yes/no questions that you're answering. So you're saying, do you see, for example, open flowers? And there's a little bit of a description that helps you understand whether you might be seeing that. And you'd answer yes if you do, and no if you don't. And then if you do say yes, there's optional subsequent information that you're asked pertaining to how many flowers or what percentage of the flower buds do you see are open on that plant. We try to invite folks to report like once a week. I know that gets to be challenging sometimes because our lives get busy. But what I have definitely identified after doing this for a number of years in my yard is I can kind of slack off when things aren't changing a whole lot, like in the middle of the summer. But right now, when I'm just starting to see the buds showing up on things, I actually do go out and make observations pretty regularly because I really like to capture when it goes from nope, not open flowers to yes, I see the first open flower. And that's actually the most valuable information to end users of the data as well. So you can get started now and you can start reporting, and they would just be all no's probably, like you don't see any leaves or flowers. But it's not a bad idea to get in there while it's fresh in your mind and just kind of check it out. Did I get it all, Erin?
Yeah, that was perfect. And then another question about making observations, are the comments that we add to our observations helpful? I don't know if we have any examples of ways that those have been used, but certainly when someone's downloading the data, that's an option for them to download the comment field in addition to the other things that you input. So definitely those are useful and available.
I would say it depends on the application. It depends on, how the data are being used, what it is that the analyst is trying to identify. And if your comment helps enrich in that story, I think absolutely. So yeah, I guess that's a great thing to pursue, to see if we could give an example where having that commented information helped somebody using those data have more confidence or tell a richer story. I don't have a good example of that, so I'll have to work on that.
Another question about inputting photos along with observations. There's a person that asked about they'd like to have the ability to have everything in a single app, and so do their phenology data, but also submit photos. And unfortunately, we don't have that capacity. We'd love to. I think it would be really interesting, but it's just very computationally expensive to be able to have photographs for every single observation. You can imagine having 24 million photographs would be a huge amount of data. So we don't have that ability, unfortunately.
Yes.
Another question about whether we cross-reference Nature's Notebook data with other data collection efforts like eBird.
Yes. Yeah, there's been a number of studies where researchers have pulled data from multiple programs and used that to tell a story. What's a good example, Erin? I know eBird is one that folks use.
Yeah, there was a publication, I think Jeremy Kellerman might have pulled in some eBird data and used that alongside Nature's Notebook tree data, I think.
As a resource, right?
Yes, yeah, that's the one that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. Yeah, we should develop a slide on that too.
Yeah, there's another, there was a study that used our spring index data alongside bird data as well. I don't know if that was from eBird, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of potential, and it could happen more, but a couple examples.
Yes, and we, incidentally, we have a paper coming out any day now that we'll make sure we mention in forthcoming newsletters, where we looked at the impact of COVID on the participation in Nature's Notebook, eBird, and a couple of other citizen science programs, iNaturalist, and then one called eButterfly, which is similar to eBird. And that's a whole nother presentation and story, but it was fascinating to see how participants in the different programs, how their response to COVID varied. Nature's Notebook was the hardest hit, and we know that this was because we have that permanent site requirement where you're making repeated observations on the same location, and in so many cases, you couldn't access your site. But with eBird and iNaturalist in particular, you can participate from anywhere. And so they saw really big spikes in participation because suddenly folks were at home, maybe out of work, have kids at home and needed something to do. And these were fun, kind of off the shelf activities to get people outside and hopefully feeling like they're doing something valuable.
Oh, yeah. Another question, is it possible for individuals to look at growing degree days, especially for a particular area? So I'm going to put in the chat the Viz tool link, because we have this really great tool on there. It's right at the top when you go to the link I just put in the chat, where you can actually put in your zip code and see how the growing degree days have accumulated so far this year, and then compare to previous years.
Yeah, I really didn't go into that. I wanted to stay focused on Nature's Notebook, but we have a number of what we call gridded data products, which are maps that are updated on a daily basis that indicate either how conditions that are related to phenology, like things like leaf powder flowering, are changing from day to day and across the country, or how actual activity in most cases insects, but in some cases plants too, are predicted to be changing over the course of the season too. So we can mention that in a future webinar at some point. But yeah, definitely, if you know what growing degree days are, or if you are curious, I suggest you to check out that link that Erin just posted.
Another couple comments or questions about access to some of these examples. I think some people would like to use them as a resource with showing to students or as a slideshow. So yeah, we can definitely make maybe a subset of the presentation available as example uses and post that on the website.
Yeah, and maybe we should mention your publication summaries too, Erin. We haven't done this in all cases, but periodically, what is it, bi-monthly or something, we try to write up kind of a public-friendly, non-technical summary of papers that have just come out that either have used the data, or in some cases it's just a phenology study that we thought was really interesting. And those are all on the website. Erin just put the link in the chat for the highlighted publications. And those are a nice resource. And you link them in the newsletters too.
Let's see. Oh, and going back to the comments on the observations, what sort of comments are helpful? Some people will put weather data in there. I think sometimes if they have a weather station where they can put in the temperature. Sometimes people will put in like the reason why they think that there are colored leaves occurring at a weird time of the year, like they suspect it's insect damage or they see evidence of disease or something on the plant. I don't know if you have other things that you can.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It was just, you know, if something that you're reporting on as a part of the phenology seems odd, and you have a idea of why it might be odd, you know, like it's been extremely dry. My tree lost all its leaves because it hasn't rained in 6 months or something like that. That's another kind of thing that people might indicate.
A question about, have there been comparisons of suburban environments landscaped with non-native landscaping and lawns to see if there's earlier leaf out or green up there?
That's an awesome question. I don't think so. I don't know who's asking that. Maybe that's a great study for somebody to undertake. I do know of, there's a small body of literature. I only know of a handful of papers that have looked at phenology in urban versus less developed locales. And I'm thinking of one in Phoenix, actually, from several years ago. So I'm happy to share those references if whoever's asking that is interested. Maybe just email me. My email is up on the screen. Or if you happen to be a student or work with students, it would be super fun to envision a study and, you know, design something to get at that better.
Yeah, and I'll also put in a plug for filling out all the metadata that you can for your Nature's Notebook sites. So all that stuff's optional, but when you sign up or register a site, there's a lot of questions you can answer about how urban is your site, the distance to the nearest body of water. And then when you register a plant, you can put in information about whether it was planted, whether it's fertilized and watered, and all that stuff would help to answer those kind of questions. Let's see. A question about using Nature's Notebook outside of the United States. in kind of getting a program going in other countries?
Well, there's nothing preventing anybody from outside of the US from submitting observations to Nature's Notebook other than the species list. The program isn't open for you to submit on any plant or animal. We have a specified list of species for which we have developed protocols, and it's something like 1,500, maybe more than that now, plants and animals. And so if you're in another country and you can identify any of those plants and animals on our list that are where you're at, then you're welcome to contribute. We do have some contributors from other countries, mostly from Canada and Mexico, because they're most likely to have some species with overlap, but we have sites registered all over the place. Beyond that, there are phenology networks that are similar to ours in many other countries. And there is an established kind of loose working group of representatives of these different countries and the phenology networks from the different countries that share information on protocols and systems and infrastructure and that sort of thing. And so if the question's more about how to get something stood up, that's certainly something we can kind of provide some guidance and some context for. We've certainly helped support phenology networks in other countries get established. We've worked closely with folks in Turkey and, Tibet? Is it Tibet or?
Bhutan, I think?
Bhutan, thank you. Thank you. Korea, I think. Yeah, there's a number of countries that we've had, varying degrees of interaction with. So that's certainly something we'd be happy to try our best to share resources with and answer questions on. Again, maybe just follow up with me directly.
Yeah, and then just something to cheer about from Beth at Signs of the Seasons. She said that in 2020, they actually had double the number of observations than previous years.
That's so fantastic.
About that. Yay.
Yay. Oh, I love hearing that. I love hearing that. We really hadn't had a whole lot of anecdotal reports of how it played out for folks. So that's super great to hear.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I think we got all the questions. So thank you all for asking so many great questions.
Yeah, and we set up a couple of follow-up questions when you close out of here. It should prompt you with a brief survey asking whether you want to do this again, because we'd be happy to try and go further and share. There are many more papers that use your data too, and I just want to be able to share the gratitude and show, kind of give back and show you that it's not a black hole. Every record matters. So thank you again, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, and we have the recording link will also be in the follow-up email that will come tomorrow. So you can look out for that as well. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Take care. Have a great day.